Let's go to Brisbane now and catch up with the member for Bowman up there who is joining us now. He is joining us now. Andrew Lemming, ready for us. Sorry about that. Love to have you plugged in there. Andrew, very keen to get your thoughts on what's transpiring here, because apart from being a politician, of course, you're a medical doctor, you have a medical background. Where are we at with the coronavirus epidemic and the control measures we have in place?
I think the control measures are excellent. We've got the best in the business meeting every day. We've got states and territories working with the Commonwealth, and I'm reminding every citizen, please read these guidelines and become familiar with them. And there's not a great deal added by kicking the tyres and asking why Australia isn't doing something that another country is. You need to remember that the Northern Hemisphere is in a completely different flu phase to Australia. I think Australia is leading the way with these decisions midnight last night to quarantine those that are arriving into the country. So this will make a significant impact, but it's going to have a huge call on local services to make sure that we can support those going into self-quarantine, remembering that around a quarter of us live alone, around 10% of people who take short trips overseas do, and we'll need to make sure that all the support is there in communities to make sure that this self-isolation actually happens for the full 14 days.
Yeah, there's an enormous amount of commentary around. Of course, everyone's got a view on this. Everybody's talking about it, whether they're in the media or not. But we're having this situation where people are getting out in the media, whether they're journalists or people from other backgrounds, saying what they think should happen, that schools should close or no one should get together in pubs and clubs, all sorts of options that may well be implemented eventually. Is it helpful to have these suggestions, or should we leave it to the chief medical officers?
It's about as helpful as you'd know, people suggesting there's going to be a crash or a crisis around the corner, or the share market will go up and down. It's just cheap seats. We've got excellent advice. You've got all of the territories and states working closely with the Commonwealth. You've got more than even daily updates, hourly sometimes. I've got hospitals that are mindful that for every case potentially of corona, there could be 1,000 cases of the common flu, and they've got to sort these out. They can't use every test kit testing every person who's worried. So again, read the guidelines. It's very clear that to be tested, one needs to have a fever or symptoms of a lung infection together with travel or contact history. So you need to follow that. Trust hospitals when they say no, they prefer not to test. And remember that the same as a common cold, we recommend self-isolation. And so that sort of separation from the rest of the community, staying at home as much as you can, not forcing yourself to go out to work or study. And the last question, which is a fair one, we don't yet have clear recommendations, something I have raised this morning, about continuing to play full body contact sport. So in that respect, again, no need to kick the tyres, just ask the question. And I'm hoping that the chief medical officers will have a view on contact sport, so particularly our football codes. It's not just about sitting in the stadium and the risk of transmission. It's ultimately the players that have rolled around with each other for a 90-minute period, and then we expect them to be going home, and should their case be found, you've effectively got multiple teams affected. This is high risk, and I'd hope that we'll be specific about those recommendations when the chief medical officers next meet.
Well, it's high risk to the sporting competitions, for instance. If a professional sporting team got an infection and they're all into isolation, well, then they're not going to be able to play for a few weeks. But the high risk of mass contamination or mass infection is not particular there, is it? Or you, otherwise, we need to be talking about kids' sport, competitive sport, right across the country.
Well, we're making very clear recommendations about staying 1.5 metres apart, and that level of separation is important both in work, school and events. It's why you're still allowed to go to school, because it's possible to go to school and keep that separation. It isn't when you go to a major conference or event where you're sitting cheek and jowl next to other people. So in sport, of course, where there's the highest form of contact imaginable, which is breathing, spraying, expiring, everything on other players, there has to be a tough call made. And I'm not going to second guess that, but it hasn't been explicitly laid out. You've seen cricket go one way, netball about halfway, the football code's doing everything they can to avoid that tough decision, and the rather curious situation where they're seeing a media call at the Broncos today where everyone has to stay on the opposite side of the players, but then you're going to throw the players in, rolling around with other players who in turn have contact with family members that may have health issues and be high risk. So you can't be one thing and the other, one foot in, one foot out. The simple question is, should we be pulling stumps on highly competitive body contact sports And unfortunately, there's not an age cut-off here. So once we agree that there isn't sufficient separation between people, then that applies to anyone of any age engaged in that activity. That could be basketball, netball as well.
I mean, it's a fascinating question, but it gets down to the basics here. The compromises, of course, that policymakers are having to make. The obvious way to stop infection is for nobody to have any contact with anybody else. But society can't function in that way, so you've got to find some sort of compromise, don't you, that minimises the spread of infection, but of course it's still going to occur at some level.
And that 1.5 metre separation is currently the recommendation. I'm happy to watch a game of rugby league where you maintain 1.5 metre separation between the players.
Great time to be playing tennis or volleyball, I would suggest. It is a fascinating topic. It's one of those other issues I'm certain we're going to get to hear more about. Just on that, Andrew Laming, when it comes to Anzac Day celebrations, Western Australia's out there, or commemorations, I should say, is out there ahead of the curve saying they're going to ban them. Of course, so many elderly people involved. They're saying it's too dangerous to get them together. I would have thought around the country there'll be the great reluctance just to not have dawn services of some kind and parades of some kind, no matter how sparsely attended they might be.
And this is moving into these absolutely unforeseen areas of what we can continue to do as a community, let alone commemorate. Something as important as Anzac Day, but it's countered by how many seniors would be involved, and frail veterans in particular. Keeping in mind that we tend to focus a lot on age, but age is just there's a confounding variable here, which is the number of chronic diseases one has as one gets older. And we know that from the age of 50 onwards, the likelihood of having chronic diseases, and many of them, increases. I think that's the key issue, people that have these chronic health conditions. Just as someone who's young with chronic disease is at risk, someone who's older that doesn't have the chronic disease is at less risk. So we're dealing predominantly with the people that have chronic disease. And so that does mean that things like major services that bring large amounts of people together are a concern, and we're just going to have to work with local authorities. Self-evidently, a smaller event is easier to manage than a large one, and one that involves veterans, we'd have to be exceedingly careful if we were to go ahead. Once again, this is going to require the value judgments, the art, as well as the science that comes from the Chief Medical Officers.
Just finally, Andrew, what about that human hothouse that is Parliament House, Canberra, Parliament due to confer next week? You'd want to be making sure that you have the minimum number of people there. Would you expect to be heading to Canberra for parliamentary sittings?
Well, you'd forgive me a small joke if they talk about politics, is the game for ugly people. I think there'll be a lot of people quite happy to stay away from Parliament unless they have to be. Having come back yesterday and missed that quarantine deadline by just a few hours, I'd hope that the whips on both sides are making sure that Parliament will be able to function. But this presents all new challenges as well. This idea that we thought that we couldn't do politics remotely, it may well have to be contemplated. It's an interesting space we're moving into.